A relatively small group here live today, and we have 72 people registered online. And so I think we should begin on time, but we will do a quick round robin of because um, Kori Schake knows many of the people in the room, but not everybody. So it'd be nice to know the audience. And then I'll introduce her. So I'm Scott Sagan, professor of political science and the co-director here at CSAC, and I work on many different issues related to nuclear weapons and most recently on ethics and public opinion. Pat.
Hi, everyone. I'm Pat Kelly. I'm a grad student in political science. I'll be teaching starting this upcoming fall at West Point, the U.S. Military Academy, and I study mostly civil military relations and conflict termination.
Steve Stedman. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law. And once upon a time, early in my career, I was kind of foolish enough to write a book chapter on how the American Civil War ended. So.
I'm a postdoc here. I study U.S.-China relations and emerging technologies like AI.
Standing.
I'm Goldgeier, visiting scholar at CSAC.
I'm Nitish Mountain. I'm Scott Sagan's research assistant. I'm from Richmond, Virginia, and lots of Confederate statues there.
Yeah.
Say something about your global science.
Oh, thank you. So I'm the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists does the Doomsday Clock every year, and that was actually featured in an ethics bowl undergraduate debate competition. And so I kind of wrote what the undergraduates thought about people like Scott and Herb's attempts to set the Doomsday Clock. So
Fabulous.
interesting.
He's writing a piece about this.
Luis Rodriguez. I'm a Stanton Nuclear Security postdoctoral fellow here, and I study the Global South contributions to limiting the use of force.
Steve Pfeiffer, William Perry Fellow here at CSAC.
Gili Vardi, the History Department. Welcome back. I study war and change in military affairs.
Harold Trincunas, Deputy Director here at CSAC. Also work on foreign and international security policies, mainly Latin America.
Hi, I'm Kate Turwey. I'm the Events and Educational Programs Manager here at CSAC.
It gives me pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Kori Schake, the Director of Foreign and Defense Policy at the American Enterprise Institute. Inside the government, she's worked on the Joint Staff, OSD, NSC, and state. She has been a senior leader at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and has taught at West Point here at Stanford. And I just found out she'll be teaching at the U.S. Naval Academy in the fall. And she's the author most recently of America and the West and co-edited a book with Jim Mattis called Warriors and Citizens. And when she told me that she had been put onto the commission to rename U.S. military bases, I thought that would be a great topic. And in typical Kori Schake fashion, she said, well, I'd like to talk about that, but put it into the much broader context of American history and American military policy after that. So I think it's great that you're come to join us today. So thank you.
It is such a great pleasure to be home on the farm. And thank you all for making time for this conversation. As Scott said, I'm on a commission that's renaming military bases. In fact, from 5:30 this morning, we were holding commission meetings to continue the process of our final selections. Couple of things. First, anybody care to take a guess? How many items in the American military inventory are named for Confederates? Take a guess. 10,000 is actually correct. The first thing the commission did was go to the services and ask them to identify everything in their inventory that
weaponry as well as
it's bases, ships, swimming pools. Yeah, 10,000, which is why the discussion of the broader context, I think, matters so much, right? William Faulkner the great novelist of the American South, famously said, the past isn't even dead, it isn't even past. And that is so much my experience of the commission. It's so indicative of the long shadow that gets cast when war termination doesn't doesn't make peace, actually full stop, doesn't make peace. You know, the Union definitively won on the battlefield. There was an unconditional surrender of the Confederate military forces. There was unitary control over those forces, right? So the frequent fear that the end of a war between organized armies would result in an insurgency that would become uncontrollable and prevent the expansion of security and governance did not happen. And despite those, and the Union committed to the economic reconstruction of the Confederate States. And despite all of those advantages, I think it's awkward but true to say that many in the Confederate States never made the cultural acceptance of slavery as the cause of the war, slavery as an unmitigated moral evil. You don't see the accountability for the causes of war that the United States government imposed, for example, on Germany and Japan at the end of World War II. And as a result of that incomplete peace, you see long shadows cast into contemporary American political life. I mean, 160 years after the end of the war, there are 10,000 articles of inventory celebrating Confederate military and governmental heroes, people who voluntarily took up arms against the government of the United States. We are still commemorating and celebrating, and are only now beginning to work our way through as the result of social justice protests, where the military was not the major offender. Does somebody have? Okay, the military was not the major offender, but the military was a useful way to symbolize social change, which the military is often used for in American society, because you have the ability to command and compel obedience to commands. So just to give an overview, I think the commission's work is indicative of the long shadow that comes with inadequate terms of war termination. You know, the North abandoned their war aims 12 years after winning the war. They didn't abandon them because they were militarily, I'm prepared to be corrected by an actual expert on it, but in my judgment, they didn't abandon the war aims for an inability to impose them by force. They didn't fail because they couldn't afford to continue the Reconstruction effort. They abandoned them for a political bargain about who would ascend to the presidency in 1876. There was a disputed election on terms actually pretty shockingly familiar to the disputed election of 2020. And it feels weirdly symbolic that we are still dealing with the war termination issues and their political consequences in similar terms all these years later. Um, the shocking consequences that the North accepted in the states of the former Confederacy in return for this bargain. I mean, the violence, not just of lynchings, the everyday violence experienced by Black Americans in the South in particular, and the poverty that continues to be perpetuated, right? Black soldiers not being able to be eligible for VA loans for homes, when for most Americans, home ownership is the basis of family wealth. Moreover, the shocking consequences pervade beyond the injustices and impoverishment and violence done to Black Americans, because it allowed the sinking of roots of this lost cause myth, the belief that an association with the Confederacy wasn't akin to support for slavery, that somehow plantation life could be venerated and dissociated from the experience and the economic necessity of slavery to, is there something for me or is that, okay, association with slavery for more than 100 years, right? Like people holding weddings at plantations and thinking it's quaint. And it perpetuated the racism in ways that shocked. I mean, it's not my field of academic study, but still, I was shocked to realize how much of that inventory of 10,000 Defense Department articles had nothing to do with the end of the Civil War, even had nothing to do, they weren't named even during the Reconstruction years in order to buy in by those communities. The two periods of time in which all of these things get named are the federal adoption of Jim Crow legislation in Woodrow Wilson's administration, and the second period of time in which it becomes prevalent is after President Truman legislates the end of segregation in the military services. There is, to this day, hanging in the cadet library at West Point, a 20-foot high portrait of Robert E. Lee in his Confederate uniform with a Black slave holding his horse. And that was given to the university in 1954 by the Daughters of the Confederacy in order to intimidate Black students who were being admitted to West Point. It's shocking that an institution that claims to create moral leaders for the country continues to walk past that. One of the things I learned working around the American military is that every time you walk past somebody who's not meeting standard, you just set a new standard. And that's the long-term consequences of war termination that attempted to, it didn't even attempt to buy near-term compliance and peace. It was the adoption of a cultural apologism in periods that had nothing to do with the Civil War. It's such a great national failure, and it raises the question of what makes stable peace. And the terms of war termination don't translate into cultural acceptance, and they don't translate into the enforcement of the law until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. You know, the passing of civil rights legislation, in particular, the Voting Rights Act. But again, we are still operating in an environment in which when the commission went to engage the communities around Fort Bragg, Fort Hood, Fort Benning, Fort Polk, I mean, there are 10 major Army facilities named for Confederates, that it was not uncommon that the communities objected to the renaming of the bases. And the commission, I mean, it's law. The 2020 National Defense Authorization Act requires their renaming, and the renaming of any Defense Department article that commemorates or celebrates people who voluntarily took up arms against the federal government. But we are still hearing the argument that, for example, and so these aren't even named for great generals, right? Who they are named for are people who were important political figures in repressing local Black populations in the aftermath of the war, right? So the founder of the local KKK, who incidentally was also a Confederate officer, is who one of the forts is named from. So I want to talk about a couple of things. First, kind of the nature of Reconstruction as war termination. And then second, the experience of the commission. Because when I was named to the commission, I was one of the 4 commissioners named by the Secretary of Defense. 4 others were named by the Congress. My expectation was that this was going to be a miserable experience, and that this was my tiny minor contribution to the ball club, my civic duty. In fact, the commission has been an amazingly affirming experience. It's a broad spread of commissioners. We have a serving Republican congressman from Georgia, and we have one of the most ardent advocates for redressing every social inequality in American history. And yet, almost every vote the commission has taken, over 90%, have been unanimous. We have allowed ourselves to be persuaded by each other, and we have chosen to do our work that way as a way to create a broader acceptance for the positive changes that we think we're making. But I'll get to that. Let me start with Reconstruction. So after the Union victory in 1865, the 11 Confederate states, President Lincoln's plan for the 11 Confederate states was initially incredibly generous, if principled. Namely, former slaves were entitled to full suffrage and citizenship. The armies of the South were going to be permitted to keep both their weapons and their transportation as a way to facilitate the economic reconstruction of the South. 3 million freed slaves became citizens. You had the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau to work locally through the 11 Confederate states, and you had the occupation of those 11 Confederate states by Union Army forces. Lincoln's assassination. So the people who were privy to Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction were Generals Grant, General Sherman, and Admiral DuPont, I think, was the only sailor. It might have been Farragut. All those sailors look alike. They had a meeting at City Point at which Lincoln outlined his plans. He hoped that the Confederate political leadership would flee the country, wanted no effort made to their capture because he envisioned the reunification of the Union to be politically easier without trials of the leadership. He was hoping to avoid the kind of judicial processes that in many other societies actually serve to create broader social acceptance. So he didn't envision anything like a reconciliation commission of the kind you have seen in South Africa and in transitional justice processes in Latin America and elsewhere. What he hoped was that they would all flee the country and be permitted to and live out their years elsewhere. Lincoln's assassination. So you had a relatively small circle and a military circle that understood that. And this has civil military consequences later down the line because Secretary of War Stanton, the Attorney General, even the civilian leadership, the Secretary of the Navy, were not privy to Lincoln's plans. And Lincoln's assassination and the empowerment of the Secretary of War and the Attorney General and the Vice President, Andrew Johnson, initially create a vengeance attitude, right? Sherman famously never speaks again to the Secretary of War because Stanton refuses to acknowledge what Grant, Sherman, and Farragut had heard from Lincoln, and instead wants a very different and much more bare sword approach to the subjugation of the southern states. That too passes very quickly because the elevated vice president, Andrew Johnson, is actually much more indulgent. And that wasn't anticipated. He was chosen by Lincoln as his vice president to embody the Union commitment of many in the southern states and to facilitate reconciliation. Once Johnson's president, he actually becomes much more, as violent attacks begin, as the KKK begins organizing, Johnson is hesitant to impose federal, not just hesitant to impose federal power, but hesitant to move forward with the abolition amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments to the Constitution. So the 13th Amendment is the abolition of slavery. So the Emancipation Proclamation carried into the Constitution. The 14th Amendment is citizenship and the commitment to equal justice under law. And the 15th Amendment, which is only voted in 1870 and really doesn't become true until the Voting Rights Act in 1965, is the right to suffrage, the right to vote. The Johnson administration sees political figures that had held elected or appointed office in the Confederacy, sees them named congressmen to the Union after the war and wants to permit it. You see high-ranking Confederate officials replacing local governments in the South. So the backlash begins very quickly. The United States Congress refuses to seat in the US Congress those former Confederate officials. And this is the fight between the president and the Congress that precipitates his impeachment. He survives the impeachment by a single vote. The role of the United States Army is so incredibly admirable in this period. They organize elections in which Black Americans vote for the first time. They enforce the ability of suffrage for Black voters. and they are local government in many places where the contestation over who could hold civilian office um, happens. In 1866, the behavior of Confederates and President Johnson creates a wave of Republican elected office holders, including those from the South enabled by the Army's enforcement of Black suffrage. So it creates both the occupation and the Army's role in the elections creates deep resentment among the Confederate lost cause types in the South. But 1866, you get a Republican majority. That's when two of the three constitutional amendments get enforced. Grant, former Union commander of the Union armies, Grant gets elected in 1868. And unlike Johnson, he stridently prosecutes the war against the insurrection. The Ku Klux Klan violence is destroyed by 1872, and you have an enforced peace in the South. And then the recession of 1873 hits, and in 1874, Democrats regain the House, and the progress, this Grant marshals through the Civil Rights Act, passes in 1875, but the Grant administration actually gets such a bad rap. And in part, the reason it gets such a bad rap is because of their enforcement of Reconstruction. History should be much kinder to the Grant administration. A lot of the stories about corruption, while true, were not out of step of corruption in America at the time, and the flames were fanned by those who advocated violence against Black Americans and their resubjugation. And then comes the presidential election of 1876. So, it's a myth that America, let me put it differently. My favorite description of Americans comes from a British historian, Bertha Ann Reuter, in 1923. And she writes, Americans are a people so extreme in politics or religion or both that they could not live in peace anywhere else. And, we mythologize an American past where the founding fathers and the architects of the liberal international order and everybody in between were statesmen rather than tawdry politicians, and they were high-minded and stood astride the world like a colossus. I don't think there's ever been an election as bitter as the election of 1800, right? And certainly the election of 1876 was even more, the threats of violence and failure of institutionalized handover of legitimate elected control in the country has never been as fraught and narrowly run as 1876. The Republican Rutherford Hayes lost the popular vote to the Democrat Samuel Tilden. It gets adjudicated in the Congress. At the end of the day, here's the bargain. In return for the abandonment of the war aims of the American Civil War, in return for the withdrawal of federal forces from the three states, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida, in which they were still stationed, in return for appointing a Southerner to the cabinet, the building of a transcontinental railroad that ran through the South, and industrial improvements, that is, economic incentives to the South, the Southern members of Congress would agree to support the Republican Rutherford Hayes. And that turned enough votes that he carried it 185 to 184. And that's really when you get the start of what in the South at the time is called the redemption movement, which is the lost cause myth that the South was only fighting for states' rights, and the noble Robert E. Lee and these other military officers as noble practitioners of the craft, and the whitewashing, quite literal whitewashing of the contributions of Black Americans and the cause of slavery out of the American narrative. So that's when Jim Crow laws begin to be not just promulgated, but socially acceptable in the South, tolerated in a way that creates a culture that we are still dealing with. Jeffrey Blaney, who wrote the single best book in my field, it's called Causes of War, and he adjudicates the history and the political science of the causes of war better than anybody else. And he told me a few weeks ago that he's actually updating the book and is going to, he thinks the most interesting question of our time isn't what causes war, but what causes peace. And so he's amending the title to say the causes of war and peace, and including a lot more of his scholarship, recent scholarship that's not yet been published, on what creates peace. Blaney's original argument in the book was that the only reliable way to create a stable and enduring peace is decisive victory on the battlefield. And he adjudicates this so beautifully in the book. But of course, the experience of the end of the American Civil War is the great contrary case, because you had all of the conditions. You had a moral victory, the association of the winning army with the emancipation of Black Americans. You had a decisive battlefield victory. You had an unquestioned economic program to facilitate prosperity in the South and substitute for plantation slavery, industrialization, and transportation linkages, and other means of prosperity. And yet it still fails. And the counterexample, I think, is the building of the liberal international order after World War II, because you do have similar conditions of decisive battlefield victory and economic devastation and moral victory. But what makes different the much more positive outcome of World War II is that in both of the major defeated combatants, Germany and Japan, you have the acceptance of a sharp break with what they had been, and a positive vision of what they were now, not just what they were going to be in the future. But both the victors of the war, the United States and its allies, and the vanquished had a common and commonly accepted vision culturally of the way forward. And that's what we give up in 1876 in the United States. And I'd be interested in particular, Scott, but also others, of how important the the compromise of the moral high ground in 1876 is to the culture that we're enduring even now 150 years later. My own conclusion is that, Sherman was right, that you actually have to impose burdens on the civilian population sufficient to have them repudiate the cause of the war. And that wasn't done comprehensively for the reasons I described. There's a Washington saying I've always liked, that in politics, paying is unavoidable, but you get to choose when you pay. And by not choosing to pay in 1876, the cost was not high in 1876 of continuing Reconstruction. But a political bargain that was made in 1876 means we're still paying the cost now. And so let me say a little bit about the commission process. We were established by law after the social justice protests in the summer of 2020. The Congress slipped into legislation that should have been passed 6 months earlier, the National Defense Authorization Act, an amendment that established an 8-member bipartisan commission to remove all of the Department of Defense things in the inventory that commemorate anyone who voluntarily took up arms against the Union. And it was not only designed to right an historical wrong, but it was also intended to send a message in the present about the importance of accountability and the importance of equal justice under law. The commission, 4 members were nominated by the Secretary of Defense, 4 members nominated by the Congress, 2 each from Republican and Democratic leaders. And it includes a Republican congressman from Georgia, a businessman from Tulsa, Oklahoma, closely associated with the Republican leadership, the highest ranking woman or Black American to ever hold a commission in the United States Navy, the retired commandant of the Marine Corps, retired Army 3-star. Let's see, who am I missing? And a couple of prominent activists for Native American rights, for Black American rights, for, civil rights. And my expectation was that this was going to be a misery. And in fact, what it has demonstrated for me, and I think for the other commissioners as well, is just how well democracy in America can work, should work, and does work in many circumstances. As I mentioned, almost every vote we have taken has been unanimous. We designed a process that where the first thing we did before we established what our ground rules were going to be for the process and for who we were going to choose, we went out and talked to the communities at the 10 big Army posts to get a sense, because American military bases are designed to be integral to communities, connected to communities, welcomed by communities. The tightest correlation between who volunteers for service in the American military is people who live around American military bases. And so that partly captures the sons and daughters of serving members of the American military, but it also shows how much the example of military service and the nature of the lives that the men and women of our military live draw in adherence. And so we want the names to be names that are supported and appreciated by the community where possible. But that's actually not our legal charge. We are to take into consideration, we are not required to defer to community because that's how you got here in the first place. And then the commission went back and for almost a year now have been talking amongst ourselves, as they used to say on Saturday Night Live. And we established the decision rules. We wanted the people we selected to be dead because we didn't want to find out later that they did things that were affronts to the very decision rules that we were putting in place. I think of the 100 finalists, I think there was perhaps one person who is still living, but they are in their late 90s. And it's one of 100. We had a preference. Our strong decision rule was we wanted to choose people that American soldiers should want to emulate. Because after all, these are military bases. And so there was a strong bias towards people who had done military service, towards people who, if they were unable to do military service because they were either legally or culturally prevented, made major contributions to the American military. One of the 100 finalists was Dr. Mary Walker, the only woman to ever be awarded the Medal of Honor. It was subsequently taken away from her during the Jim Crow period and then was reinstated in, I think, 1977. Dr. Walker was one of the first American women to hold a medical degree. She was a surgeon in the Union Army, was taken captive. She administered medical care both to Union and to Confederate soldiers. She was taken prisoner because she had remained in territory that was controlled by the Confederate forces in order to administer medical assistance to those Confederate soldiers. She was swapped after several months and came back into Union service. In the parade that was held in Washington after the end of the Civil War, Memorial Bridge in Washington was built in order that the Union armies could march from Robert E. Lee's confiscated home to the national capital. Sherman had Dr. Walker march at the head of his army because he thought she best represented what they achieved. And yet she never held a commission in the American military because women could not hold commissions in the American military at the time. I want to put up pictures of two of the other 100 finalists because it, I think, will exemplify why the commission felt so strongly that there were hundreds of good choices. And we are in the joyful position as we move towards finalizing the choices which we'll do in the next month, of choosing from among good choices. There's literally not a bad choice among the 100 people who are the finalists. And we made the list public. You can see it on the commission website if you're interested. And when the commission reports out to the Secretary of Defense and the Congress in another month, we are going to share the stories of all 100 of the finalists because they're amazing and so inspiring. So when we went to the communities, we didn't just engage with the civilian community, we also engaged with the military community. And I want to tell my favorite story of talking to a soldier. When we went to Fort Hood, one of the soldiers who came to talk to us admitted that he was only there as punishment from his sergeant. And yet, since he had to be there, he'd gone and done some research, and he wanted to recommend somebody we should consider, a Medal of Honor recipient named Reuben Rivers, who is one of the 100 finalists. But I want to share the story of 2 of the other 100 finalists. Private First Class Sadao Monomori. His family were in Japanese American internment camps when he chose to come into military service. You can read his amazing record. And of course, he was awarded it posthumously. Now, I'm not going to read it because I'm going to start crying if I do. Okay, everybody done? And the second of our 100 finalists is Sergeant Powhatan Beatty. He was born enslaved in Virginia. His family acquired their own freedom before the Emancipation Proclamation, moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, a state, a free state, but a border to Kentucky, which was a slave state. Cincinnati, where they moved, is on the border. When the Civil War broke out, the mayor of Cincinnati rounded up all of the Black men to impress them into service to build fortifications for the city, which prevented it falling to raiding. When Union states began organizing Black regiments, he volunteered. As you can see, he was twice nominated by white officers to be made an officer and was not. He participated in the relief of Petersburg. His unit took 80% casualty, 80% casualties crossing the Petersburg crater. And he was in 1865 awarded the Medal of Honor for his service in the campaign for, where was it? New Market Heights, where again, do they have no, they don't have the, of the his entire unit at the Battle of New Market Heights. All of the officers were killed. He took up leadership of a unit in which only 16 soldiers survived, but they carried the position, and that was for which he was awarded. And just try and imagine the difficulty of awarding a Black man a Medal of Honor in 1865. And that gives you a sense of some of the amazing soldiers and contributors to the American military that the Commission has had the privilege to learn about and to educate our fellow Americans about when the Commission concludes its work in another month. And Scott, I will stop there.
Great, thank you. I'm going to make the first comment and ask a question, but I want to start thinking names around the room here, and for those people on line, if you could put your question into the Q&A, they're able to do it. But let me ask the first one. So if I could ask people online to enter your question into Q&A, I'm going to ask the first question, and while Kori's answering it, then I'll take the names here in the audience. I don't have a good answer at all about the cultural continuity of these biases, but I do have a question. You noted the number of camps named for Confederates beginning in the Woodrow Wilson era, and I've always understood, I think, way too simply, that this was partly a recruitment effort to get Southern boys to join the Army and to create the local communities that would be supporting of those bases. And you hinted at that. But I'd like you to comment on the degree to which you think that was true versus the actual beliefs and the ideology of Jim Crow on behalf of some of the leaders going through with that. And here I think there's another myth, not the myth of the lost cause, but the myth that all U.S. soldiers on the Union side had become abolitionists, had drunk the Kool-Aid of Abraham Lincoln and Grant. And we know about George McClellan and many others who wanted to have peace with the South, but let them keep slavery. And a research question, that whether you do this or whether others like Pat here who are interested in this would be to look at those 10,000 items. How many of them are in the South, and how many of them are in the North? Your commentary about West Point suggests something quite different than recruiting Southern boys. It says it's an acceptance or a greater acceptance of white supremacy than the myth of Union solidarity for abolition entails. Can you comment on that set of comments? I'll take questions from others.
Yeah, I think those are both really important points. I have not done the research myself, so I don't know the answer to the extent that the Army leadership believed naming bases for Confederates would increase recruitment. But I would point out that recruitment was running fast and furious at the time that the bases were named, right? So as the US comes into World War I think by the summer of 1918, the United States is feeding 10,000 soldiers a day into the European theater. 10,000 soldiers a week into the European theater. And as far as I know, I'd be prepared to be contradicted by an actual expert, but I don't know of any difficulty recruiting soldiers for the Allied Expeditionary Force. So it may have been a motivation, wasn't a necessary motivation at the time, and it certainly wasn't a necessary motivation after integration of the Army, because you had conscription. So it's an interesting question. Not to my knowledge, was it driven by recruitment? On the Union abolitionists, of course, that's such a great point. The draft riots in New York City, the unpleasantness of people being able to buy their way out of service, and the social consequences of only the poor, and in particular, newly immigrated Irish communities. There's a really fabulous book that I offer if you've not read it. It's by, I'm not going to get his name right. The title of the book is How the Irish Became White. And it's a really interesting sociology of the way that at the time of large-scale Irish immigration to the United States, there was the expectation that um, I that Irish immigrants would begin intermarrying with Black Americans because they had the same kind of social stature and the same economic insecurity. And the book traces the conscious choices by Irish American communities, including virulent racism against Black Americans, in order to differentiate themselves, taking public service jobs in order to create stature in communities, starting their own banks and loaning money only to their own community, those kinds of things. So you're certainly right that there were doubts among a lot of people, even those fighting in the Union Army, that abolition should be the point of it. And that certainly does carry in to the tolerance for the 1876 decisions. Thank you.
This is awesome. This is just, it's great.
What did I have wrong, my friend? You've written on this subject.
So I think, so the historiography, I think, would be, I think the biggest issue that they would take with you is that the economic program of Reconstruction of the South was inadequate. I think there's an enormous amount of history that says what was actually at stake was not just trying to industrialize the South. Industrializing, it was a real agrarian society, and this was the crux of the matter is you were actually going to have to just completely overturn the old planter sector, right? So there was going to be, it was going to be really nasty, and it wasn't just a question of industrializing. It was, what do you do with this whole class, right? And I think that's what they would say. I think there are two aspects of this story that I think are still relevant to what you're doing. The one is how quickly the North allowed sort of party politics to determine what they thought was best, as opposed to what was normatively best in terms of how you, I mean, 70s, I mean, from, Andrew Johnson, of course, is not the same party as Lincoln. And Andrew Johnson is immediately thinking about what is going to happen to the Democratic Party, right? And the Democrats in the North are thinking, we can reconstruct ourselves, the Democratic Party, only through the remnants of the whites in the South. And the Republicans are thinking, we can rebuild ourselves because of the freedmen, right? And so, that was a very nasty part of this. But the one, the question that you asked, Scott, I think one of the most shameful parts of this is that the North came to a judgment, many people in the North came to a judgment that this was about ending slavery, not ending white supremacy, right? Slavery as an institution was awful, but somehow white supremacy is the natural order of things. And if you talk about bad historical timing, this is the time of social Darwinism coming into play and all kinds of ideas about race, right? That would feed into this, that we did our part, we did enough, and now it's just the natural order of things, right? And those to reconcile with are the whites, not the freedmen. We're just going to leave them to their fate, kind of thing. And I just want to say on what you're doing right now, as an Army brat, growing up on Army bases was the most diverse experience of my life, right? Ever. I mean, and what you're trying to do to me is honor the diversity that you actually find on these bases, right? And the people who work there. So I think this is wonderful.
It's a beautiful reflection. One of two of my favorite finalists are Hal and Julia Moore, husband and wife, those of you who are defense experts may have read the book, and some of the rest of you may have seen the movie We Were Soldiers Once and Young. Hal Moore is the person depicted in that. But the commission is considering for a base name for both him and his wife. Had to move off of military bases when the soldier deployed. Like, you get kicked out of your home. That's exactly right. And she became an advocate for caring for military families in lots of ways like that. And she would personally, when you had these communities that were just military families whose soldier was off fighting the war, anytime two soldiers in uniform showed up, everybody knew that it was a death announcement. Your point about slavery not as big as white supremacy and the ease with which Americans dissociated the two, I think that's a fabulous point. And I agree with you about the contemporary application of political parties glossing over in order to rebuild themselves. My own Republican Party in particular.
Haley Vardy.
Thank you. Thank you, Kori. This is great. I do have a comment and a question about the historical analysis and what we should take from it. Commemoration is always, always, always a process of an outcome of a political process. And this is what we're, part of what you're doing now, but also was done in the past. And I was fascinated by the Wilson comment, because if you think about it, right, Wilson was very much, when he thought of the post-World War, he was very much inspired by his understanding of the feeling of defeat, what it is like being defeated. And this informed a lot of his decision making about Germany in the future. Now we know that this attempt failed, but we also know that this attempt taught us all something, right? When designing the one attempt that was successful. And I would add to it that you can be successful, as you said, only if you create this complete divorce with the past. But this divorce with the past can only happen as part of a not just decisive victory, a decisive victory in a total war. And this was not the case here, right? It was a decisive victory, but it didn't happen as a part of a total war, even though it felt total at the time. My question is this: is there a way of commemorating without celebrating? Because I found it very interesting that when you said commemorating, you always attach celebrating, or almost always attach celebrating with it. I would say that yes, a lot of the commemoration we definitely ought to get rid of, but maybe not all of it. Right? So can we commemorate without celebrating?
So I love that challenge. I think it's something we discussed at great length. And actually, one of the things that bonded the commissioners together was working our way toward a common view that celebration is wrong, commemoration is even wrong. Acknowledgement of what occurred and what it meant to the people who experienced it is the way, right? So, for example, one of the challenges is that by renaming these bases, you're whitewashing the past. And whitewashing the past would mean denying it was ever named Fort Polk, Fort Hood, or why it was named Fort Polk, Fort Hood. And what we are doing is saying that these names, these commemorations, are now so far outside the acceptability of our social norms that we don't want to continue them forward. We're not denying that they were important and relevant in the past, but even commemoration is further than an affront to our values takes us. And so we, for example, favor taking down statues that commemorate Confederate victories, art that commemorates Confederate victories. West Point has a huge garden that seems to tell that both the military leaders of the Confederacy and the Union were sort of equally professionals, and we can celebrate both of their service, or we can at least commemorate both of their service. I think the commission doesn't agree with that. That commemorating on equal terms is celebrating. And so where we navigated to was a place where statues, that portrait of Robert E. Lee that's such an affront at West Point, that belongs in the West Point Museum with a placard that explains when it was given, under what terms it was given, and when it was taken down and why it was taken down. That's the acknowledgement of our complicity and our guilt, but also our resolution as a society. And I think many American communities are working their way to the same place. But it's hard and it's unpleasant, and there are people who feel they are being disenfranchised by that approach. And yet we still have to find a way to make our peace with this.
Jim Goldgeier?
Oh, I'm sorry. One other quick thing about the divorce with the past, because it connects to the point about economic reconstruction. Sherman, at one point, in speaking of the Confederate cavalry, comes closest, I think, to the nub of it when he says they must all either be killed or employed by us because there is nothing else for them. And the struggle to create something else for them is a lot of what the Freedmen's Bureau was doing, what the Army was trying to do, and what we just gave up on because the politics of the moment felt more important. Yes,
Oh my
Professor
gosh, this has
Goldgeier.
been so amazing. Thanks so much for this. And wow, what a privilege to serve on this commission, and just great that you are on that commission. And I'm just thinking, just the importance of education. I'm thinking about my own experience. I grew up in Baltimore, which is a southern city. The things that I learned in school. I'm sure I did school reports growing up on people like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson as very heroic figures. Robert E. Lee Park was right around the corner from where I grew up, and it's only been renamed very, very recently. And we were taught great generals leading this force, sort of Civil War as a difference of opinion, right? But not
Yeah.
nothing about nothing about treason, for sure. And I'm just curious. It's great that you have this diverse group of people in the commission, that it's operated so well to and being able to be so unanimous. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on as the work comes to its conclusion, sort of the challenge at a time when we've got all these battles in these communities about what's being taught in the schools and which books are allowed in the school library and all of that, the politics surrounding what people like me when I grew up. I mean, I don't know what my school teaches now. I'm hoping they're teaching something different than what I learned. But like that's really important that they would teach something different than what I learned, because what I learned they shouldn't still be teaching, and just
Yeah.
how that gets.
It's such an important challenge. And so I have a couple of reactions to it. First, that the Washington creates commissions when they want somebody other than the people responsible for everybody to be mad at. And that's our job, right? But it's also our job to serve the educational purpose and to be able to say, really, you think Braxton Bragg is a better choice than Sergeant Beatty? Let's have a conversation about that. Why is Braxton Bragg a better choice? Because there's no substitute for winning the argument. And you're right that what we are experiencing in the commission is a tiny microcosm of our bigger, broader social and cultural reckoning about 150 years of American history. So it's hard, and it's gonna be hard, and it's unpleasant. And that's the nature of change, right? Like one of my favorite reflections is somebody saying, there is a difference between exploring and following a map. And exploring is how you create change. Everything else is just following a map. And so what we're trying to do is demonstrate what is possible in good faith. And all of us none of us are going to get our first choices for stuff. But Abraham Lincoln wasn't anybody's first choice in 1860 either. And what we're trying to do is demonstrate there is a wide range of good outcomes that people of good faith can reach. If you listen carefully and empathetically to what other people are experiencing of this. And there are definitely, people involved in the process who are not empathetic to other people's perspective on it. And yet, we still gotta make progress. And we're hoping that the educational aspects of this, of having conversations like this about really, Private First Class Munimori isn't good enough. Why wouldn't he be good enough? And why doesn't he represent the apogee of citizenship in our country? By choosing good choices, we hope to make progress on the political argument that's so painful in other parts of our society.
Steve Pfeiffer. First of all, Kori, thank you for a great talk. It made the commute in from Morgan Hill today worth it.
Thank you, my friend.
Yeah, one question, kind of a mechanical, and another more philosophical question. The mechanical question is, okay, you've now identified the 100 names. Now, does the commission actually then decide, okay, this base gets this name, and then is that 100 names going to go to the 10,000 names that you want to change, or how does that all work out? What's the process going forward?
Mm-hmm.
Do you talk to local communities and say, here are our 4 or 5 candidates for your base? How does that work? And then I guess the philosophical question is more the comment that you made about the changes reflect in part changes with regard to social justice, which I think is right. I mean, belatedly, things that we have not done in our history or things that we should have done earlier. But I think it's also because you said accountability. It's about these officers basically committed treason. They betrayed their oaths to the union, and presumably that was a problem also back from 1865 on. So I'm just not sure if I'm comfortable with the fact that it's just about social justice now, but it's also belatedly understand that these folks, in fact, betrayed oaths that they took to the country.
Yeah. Wes. Oh, please go ahead. Please.
with regard to the sort of the mechanics of what happens next, to what extent are you concerned? What's the timeline? Are you concerned that any changes brought about, for example, if the House changes hands in the November elections or the presidential elections in 2024, are they sort of, can the politics still come back in that this process tried to sort of set aside somewhat? So if you could just comment on that, that'd be great.
Sure. So the mechanics are, once we identified the 10 finalists for each base, and we tried to choose people who had connections to the locality. If the base is in Virginia, we would hope to have a Virginian to name it after. And so we have historians working for the commission who, once we came up with the decision rules for here are the people we're looking for, please go find us some of those people. And then we narrowed it down to 10 per base. We went back to the communities with the 10, said, are there any that particularly resonate with you? A couple of communities already had their answer, right? Like they came to us with, here's a local boy who made good, and we as a community want this. And the commission is inclined to wide deference to that. You know, if you're picking one of the 10 good choices and your community's like, that's great, less work for us. But we're not bound by what communities want. So one of the like last meshing of preferences is, once we have a slate of 10 of potential names, what does that look like? Right? Very few military bases are named for enlisted soldiers or NCOs. And that's one thing that seems odd to us and seemed odd to a lot of the soldiers we were talking to, right? There are very few bases named for people of color, for Native Americans, for women, for military spouses. And so we have a whole list of potential turns of the kaleidoscope to give us different patterns. And we want to look at the Big 10 in particular to be able to send positive messages about how that we would like those changes to perk down through the other 10,000 things. So we are not attempting to rename everything. What we are likely to do is rename the 10 bases. Well, our legal authority is to recommend to the Secretary of Defense that he make the following changes. And then to recommend that the military services who control these inventories follow our decision rules as they rename everything else that they are legally required to rename. And we're likely to encourage our decision rules holding for future naming of things as well. So that's where the process goes. The secretary could reject our names and take it on his own responsibility to have the kinds of debates and political blowback we are likely to have. I'd be surprised if he didn't avail himself of the protective shield of our bodies on the train tracks. The work of the commission will be done and reported out in June. And it is our fond hope that we are well enough in front of a political process that it will not tempt the Congress on either side of the line to either want to improve upon our work or set it aside. but we conscientiously are trying to stay out of the political discussion for the obvious reasons.
Let me go to the Zoom audience. And we have a question from, I guess, General and Dr. Jonathan Shimshoni, saying, is there a fundamental difference between stable war termination of an interstate war and of a civil war of a separatist nature? In one, you get rid of a regime, but keep the state intact. And the other, you deny the separatists their 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 goal and join them in. I guess this is a comparative question. You might have an answer. Steve might have an answer, having written on this. Is the phenomenon that you're describing of creating lost cause myths, compromises of the victor to, is that more common in civil wars because of this problem, or is the U.S. Civil War unique or at least unusual in that respect?
Well, that's a great question to which I am not properly educated to give an answer. So I'll give a guess, and then Steve, maybe you could give an actual answer. My guess is that it probably, so I absolutely acknowledge that there are important war termination differences between interstate wars versus civil wars. And it seems to me that that interstate wars may be easier to handle the war termination and aftermath because there's less temptation to stop fighting before you achieve a total victory in an interstate war. Whereas in a civil war, you're going to try and reconstruct the society. So you might not get as clear cut a military decision, and you might be more deferential to some social aspects. But it also seems to me that civil wars, because they are about the domestic polity, the political compromises may be harder to reach. But I'm guessing, Steve, you actually know the answer.
There's been a transformation in how we think about how civil wars end. When I started working on this in the 80s, the line, and it came from like Eclay's "Every War Must End," where he's just dealing with interstate wars, because he said, well, civil wars don't end in negotiation. They're total wars in limited settings, and all this stuff that I'm doing about negotiation doesn't hold. And empirically, he was pretty right. In the first, from about 1825 to 1980, there were only like 5 or 6 civil wars that had ended through negotiation, through a negotiated settlement. It almost always was one side winning a military victory, eliminating the other, but very rarely did you have negotiation. Of course, in interstate wars, lots of negotiated settlements to the ends of wars, right? At the end of a civil war, though, if you have won a military victory and it involves secession, right? There's several things that have to happen. One is you're going to have to figure out how the Sherman quote that you had, what are we going to do with all these folks in arms, right? Because we don't want them to turn into guerrillas, to bandits, right? We're going to have to think about them differently. How do we reincorporate them? The danger, of course, is that it's very difficult in a democracy where you have party competition, like in the North, you had a thriving democracy, thriving party competition, and every decision that they're taking about the South is shadowed by, is this going to be to our benefit as the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, right? And I think that, and again, that's such a huge part of 1865 to 1877.
That's a great point. Thank you.
We have a question, I'll paraphrase from John Harvey, which is, how do you, after going through this experience, think about Robert E. Lee in terms of his, I guess, reputation? Clearly a traitor against the Union. Does the Lost Cause myth change our views about his generalship? And we need to rethink that as a general. And what about his decision to end the war, or at least end the military operations on his own authority, as far as I can tell, without orders and deeds or contrary to what Jefferson Davis wanted him to do when Petersburg and Richmond were falling?
Dr. Harvey, it makes me joyful to hear your voice. That's grand. Okay, so the reevaluation of Robert E. Lee. I think objectively, Robert E. Lee is a fine general, right? He was good at the trade craft of it. I think, one of the things Lee says that really strikes home for me is, when you have the musical chairs of Lincoln keeping firing commanders of the Army of the Potomac, Lee comments, "I sure hope he doesn't keep this up until there's somebody whose judgment I can't guess." And that's fine strategy, right? If you think about Ernie May's wonderful book about why France falls so fast in 1941, it's because the Germans understood the nature of the leadership of the opposition. And Robert E. Lee had that ability. He was also a really elegant war planner, right? The grit to fight through Antietam, despite the losses, the understanding that it wasn't enough to win battles. He had to have political triggers like the invasion of the North that would persuade outside intervention. What he needed to achieve two things. First, as long as you have an army in the field, you have a rebellion. So he needed to keep an army in the field. He couldn't lose all of it, which accounts for some of his caution in certain circumstances. And second, you needed to win dramatic, big gamble victories to precipitate British or French recognition of the Confederacy before the economics of the Confederacy became untenable. And so I think those are both really high-level, important decisions. Most military officers, with apologies, are fabulous tacticians and never become strategists. And Lee was an actual strategist. Grant had a better strategy in addition to better equipment. Where I think the Lost Cause inflates Lee's generalship is, first of all, it treats him like he was the only smart guy around. And that's clearly untrue, right? Buford's elegance in the creation of the cavalry arm is something Lee wasn't smart enough to, right? So he's a smart guy. The second thing that I think inflates it is just how good Lee's lieutenants were. The difference in the fortunes of the Confederate Army when you have Stonewall Jackson versus when you have Jubal Early, right? So Lee has the good fortune of being surrounded by talent in a way the leadership of the Union Army was much less so, at least early on. Yeah. Until you churn through and find the ones. The other thing is the conflation of Lee as a pretty good general with Lee as a noble human being. those two things, there's a lot of support for the former, there's a lot less support for the latter. And Lee, I think it's appropriate that at no point during Lee's lifetime was the political leadership of the United States willing to exonerate him. And that wasn't a military judgment. That was a slave-holding traitor judgment, which I think was and remains correct.
Apologies for some people in the room and then even more people online. It's 1:30 and we should close. So please join me in thanking Kori Schake for an absolutely fantastic seminar today.
Thank you, my friends, for the pleasure of this conversation.